This is the story of how a line of graffiti started a revolution. One evening, a teenage schoolboy was holding a can of black spray paint. He says some other boys talked him into tagging his school with the words Ancak ya doktor, meaning it's your turn, doctor, referring to Bashar al-Assad. These words sparked the beginning of what would become the Syrian war. To understand how, it's important to remember this happened while the Arab Spring was erupting. Protests in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya all led to the fall of their leaders, and Syria's Bashar al-Assad wasn't going to allow it. On March 6, about 15 boys from this school in Daraa were arrested and tortured by Assad's Ba'athist security forces. Their parents and community elders begged for their release, but were reportedly told, forget about your children. Go have new kids. If you can't, send us your wives, and we'll get them pregnant for you. Word spread, and on Tuesday, March 15th, peaceful protests in Damascus and Aleppo organized in what they called a day of rage. This was a turning point, and the government reacted violently. That Friday, thousands of locals in Daraa took to the streets to demand the boys' release, as well as call for democratic reform and an end to corruption. Security forces shot at them, killing 4 protesters. The next day, 10,000 protested at the funerals for those killed. Again, security forces fired into the crowd, killing 6 and injuring over 100. During the next week, several other protests, clashes, and killings took place, and 15 days after their arrests, Assad sent representatives to Daraa and released the teens. But the uprising had already been set in motion. By the end of March, over 100,000 people were rallying in Daraa. 45 days after a single act of graffiti, there were protests all over the country, calling for Assad to step down. Dozens were killed by Syrian security forces and many more injured. Then, on April 18th, in the city of Homs, hundreds of thousands marched to the city's Clock Tower Square for a sit-in protest. At dawn the following day, Assad's security forces stormed the square and opened fire on the unarmed crowd. What became known as the Clock Tower Massacre was a pivotal point in the uprising. Soon after, nearly half of Syria's 220,000 security forces defected. Military arms depots were open to civilians, and what had been a peaceful uprising became an armed resistance. Despite all this, Assad and his remaining forces never relented. Since 2011, nearly 500,000 people have been killed, and over 10 million Syrians have been displaced, with Assad's forces responsible for at least 90% of all civilian deaths. Now, the conflict involves players from across the globe backing different sides. Who knows what the final outcome will be?